Hey, so I kind of like this idea of these, maybe slightly more concise, verbal deliveries, verbal essays. Um, and as I tend to have a cocktail, I thought I'd take a page out of literary libations and tell you what I'm drinking. Lewis and Clark Northwest Dry Gin. It's not my favorite, but I thought I'd give it a shot. It's relatively inexpensive. It's you know. Um, with a little soda and lime, it's not what I would recommend, but it's what I'm drinking right today, and with some soda and a maraschino cherry, it tastes just fine. Um, I want to. I'm going to make a claim, and then I want to talk about this claim because I think it has such a huge implications. And that claim is there's no such thing as language. I want to say, in fact, that there is no such thing as language. That we suppose that there's this thing language. Linguists like to tell us there's a thing language over here that I can look at, right? And it has certain rules, certain modes of behavior, certain elements, right? One of those elements is words, right? Another element is grammar. Another is inflection. And inflection is when a word changes depending on its part of speech, right? So I becomes me when it becomes the object. Or verbs inflect all the time, right? I go, he goes, right? And then we have the irregular verbs like to be, I am, she is, we are, dramatically different. So we imagine that language has these sort of set of inflections and a set of rules and this thing that we can sort of assess. And in fact, the structuralist linguist, Fernand de Saussure, and his ilk, suggested that there's sort of two components of language. One is what they call langue, 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 which was the structure, the ahistorical component of language. Right? It's not that it wasn't historical; it's that it's a set system. It's not essentially temporal. And then they have this thing called parole, Parole, which is spoken or uttered language. Right? It can be written too, but an actual use of language. Right? So on the one hand, they broke language up into a structure and then the use of the structure. And of course, they decide that, well, it's much easier to study the structure. So we're also going to focus on that, and we're not going to talk so much about parole, right, or the actual utterance of language. But it doesn't take a genius to sort of see the epistemological problem there, right? And that's enter Jacques Derrida, in his essay Structure, Sign, and Play. And then of grammatology, and it's like, where is this structure exactly, and how do you separate a structure from an utterance, from its use? Every moment of language is a moment of it used, right? Doesn't that sort of seem obvious? Like where would the structure exist, right? Where is this thing, and how do I look at it, right? How do I look at it without using the very thing that I'm looking at? Does that make sense? I can't get outside of the language to look at the language. It's never right in front of me because the minute I'm looking at it, I'm already inside of it. And this was Derrida's point, that every structure has a moment in it that can't exist as part of that structure, that undoes that structure. And in this case, that would be parole, right? The actual use of language. There's a certain tendency to try to suggest that there is this, some sort of set structure, something above us all, like the rules of language. Dictionaries, right? Dictionaries suggest that these words and they reference things, and that's what language is, and they try to deliver it in such a way that they're sort of untainted, or they're they're not subjective. It's not poetry. It's not interpretation. It's just the definition as is. But come on, that's absurd, right? Somebody came up with that style and said this is what an entry would look like, and this is the tone of voice. As a living, I sometimes write guidelines for companies. How they speak. Somebody created a guideline for Webster's, right? And what it sounds like. What are the rules of writing a definition? And then someone wrote it. And Derrida makes this nifty move, and then it sort of takes off in the academy and sort of left-wing critique, which is, the suppression of labor, right? But a dictionary suggesting that these words and these definitions in the book itself sort of come down from on high, not only suppresses the fact that these things are uttered, right? That they are subjective, they're spoken by somebody, written by somebody, but also suppresses labor, right? It suggests that the thing comes pre-given, that language comes pre-given, that it's a common gesture of sort of marginalization or suppression / repression of labor, of the structural necessities of actually having this dictionary. Somebody had to write it. Some labor was involved. Somebody had an opinion. Somebody had a style guide. It doesn't just come from on high. Right? What Derrida begins to do there in what is called post-structuralism, hence the name post-structuralism, is question and begin to realign the relationship between structures and instances, right? What we actually do. What there is, as we claim, are the rules and what we do. I got very excited when I first read Derrida and deconstruction. I was maybe a junior in college, about 1989, and it is exciting and it's great. And Derrida is super, super complicated, and in which he imagines that language always involves, or communication always involves what he calls this double gesture of what he calls différance, right? In which meaning is put forth and then infinitely deferred, because you'll never get there. There will never be a fixed point, right? Nothing will ever be established. An example I always use to talk about that, it's I think sort of a famous one, I don't know, I assume, is a dictionary, right? You look up a word in a dictionary, but how do you know the meaning of those words, right? In order to know what that word means, you got to look up all the words in that definition, right? But when you go to all those words in that definition, you got to go to the other words in that definition, right? Until you're literally infinitely going, and you'll never come to a stop. That makes sense. So meaning is infinitely deferred. That's deconstruction in a nutshell. That's what Derrida inaugurated, and what's been called post-structuralism and deconstruction. Deconstruction is the particular act of reading for those moments, for the moments in which a text or an argument puts forth a position, and at the same time, in the very constitution of that system, it undoes itself, right? In some way, it suppresses labor, it suppresses gender, it suppresses its own creation, hence deconstruction. We can see the terms on which this thing was constituted, including the repressed terms, right? In this case, parole, right? The actual act of speaking, of uttering, the actual act of language, of communication. Whenever I'm about to bring up Wittgenstein, and it's, I feel like whenever you bring up Wittgenstein, it's sort of the end of the conversation. But I suppose that's a sort of inside joke to people who study philosophy. But the beginning of philosophical investigations, which is fucking fantastic, hats off to Wittgenstein. I don't know why I still find him absurd. I made the mistake of reading his biography, and all I can do is picture this cranky guy boxing a student's ears. Makes it hard to take his philosophy seriously. Never read biographies of people you like. They generally just ruin that person for you. But he opens philosophical investigations by talking about Saint Augustine, however you want to say it, his Confessions. And in the very beginning, Augustine says, well, he's talking about his, how he came into his life and his whole passage to his spirituality and his faith, and he's describing how he learned language. And he says, well, I'd be around, and a grown-up would look at something and say, point at let's say a pencil, and say pencil, and hence I learned the word pencil. Well, Wittgenstein's like, yeah, I'm not so sure that's how language. I'm not sure that's how language works. He's like, maybe that's how learning a second language works, but a first language. He's like, I'm just not sure that's how that works. Well, why not? Well, think about it for a second. Let's say you don't know anything. You don't know anything. You don't already know a language. You're 18 months old, and I point at a pencil and I say pencil. how the fuck do you know what pencil signifies in this particular case? Does it signify a writing utensil? Does it signify, as opposed to a pencil in general, right? It makes me think of the Curb Your Enthusiasm, where Wandering Bear asks him for a pencil, and he says he has a pen. And he's drawing the distinction between a pen and a pencil. They're not the same thing, right? They are subsets of another category, writing utensil, right? So I point at something and say pencil. So what exactly do I mean? Do I mean pencil? Do I mean writing utensil? Do I mean long, skinny thing, right? So a fork, maybe, a finger. Other things could also be called pencil. Does it mean yellow? How would you know it didn't mean yellow? How do you know it's not the actual act of pointing? I'm pointing on a pencil, right? There's not this magic correlation between the word and then the meaning sort of attaches to it. Wittgenstein saying that's not how learning a language works. He's saying maybe that's how a second language works, where you're already in the throes, in the structure, already enmeshed within a structure. And there someone can point to pencil, and you can point and be like, are you telling me that's a writing utensil? You tell me a pencil as a subset of writing utensils. All right. So he says, well, I want to say that's not how language works, according to Wittgenstein. And for Wittgenstein, language is what he famously refers to as language games. And that the use of a word is not as much the designation of a thing, right? It's not as much a signifier. I don't use a word to point to something. I don't say glass, and I mean this, as much as the utterance of a word, or the use of a word. Now, utterance, only fucking natural language philosophers use the word utterance. I apologize. Any use of a word is a moment, a move, right, within a set of dynamics, right? Within a game that has certain rules and conditions, but without a winner, right? So it's a mode of operation. That became really clear to me when my son, who's now 16, but when he was quite little and learning, going to school and being taught structures of knowledge. He was very, very young, before first grade, and I'd find him, and he would do these hilarious things where he liked to begin talking about things, right? And he would say, the zebra is a mammal of the solar class of data within we discern. I didn't use the word discern, and the words were nonsense, but it was all delivered with the affect, the structure, within the rules of knowledge delivery within our culture, right? In another culture, the way he was speaking might seem completely insane. But within our culture, he had learned a posture, right? He didn't learn what words meant. Not quite yet. He had some sense of what some words might mean, right? Which makes me think of when he was really little, and we'd show him, books of animals and be a cow, and you'd see the black and white cow and go, moo. I remember once I was out with him in a grocery store, and there was a woman there, and she had on some black and white clothing, and he just moo, which is brilliant, right? Because again, it goes back to what is and I'm pointing at a pencil. I say pencil. What am I signifying? When he sees a cow and he sees that picture and we go moo, what exactly is it that's mooing, right? Is it all things that are black and white, right? Is it cows? There was something just fantastic about that. Having a kid, really watching him learn, taught me a ton about things I'd read. Talking like this sometimes, one loses a train of thought. He would speak with a certain tone, use certain words in a certain rhythm, such that he commanded a certain position vis-a-vis his audience. He knew that when you spoke this way, people would look at him. He knew how to deliver what counts as knowledge, authoritative knowledge within our culture, or at least in as much as he had learned it, right? Kids, we always show them like nature documentaries and things, right? And so that's what he was aping, right? That's what Wittgenstein called a language game. like the language game of knowledge delivery, particularly scientific knowledge. It's always delivered in that tone. Literary knowledge less so, right? It's not really considered knowledge, right? It's considered interpretation or critique or something, right? They never talk to really to the philosophers to understand things. They always ask scientists. Drives me nuts. But there are these different localized language games, different rules, right? So the idea here is that language isn't the system of words with their reference or the grammar and how words can go together to forge sense, forge meaning. Language is an operation, a social operation. You can't really separate the semantics from the social, right? That it's always, and it's not a word he uses, but that a later philosopher, John Austin, would use. It's performative. The use of a word inaugurates an action, creates something, distributes bodies. Deleuze and Guattari use this phrase "order words," right? That words are words distribute bodies, right? That's what they do, right? And I if I remember correctly, the example they use, one of the examples they use is when a jury, it's a trial and a jury says guilty, right? All of a sudden, they didn't just say a word that means something. They might have also done that. But first, not primarily, but fundamentally, what's happened is an entire rearrangement of postures and social standing in the world. Now, this person now will go into a certain institution. He's looked at a certain way. It smells of the ontological. Maybe he is now a criminal. It's a funny thing about our culture. It seems like criminality is an action, not a trait, but that's another question. Right, you utter guilty, and what again they call an order word, right? Rearranges bodies, right? When my son was little, and he would try to speak in this sort of scientific knowledge mode, he was distributing bodies, right? All of a sudden, we turn to him. He has the stage. He becomes the expert. And he, of course, crack up because he knew he didn't know anything. But that was language at work, right? Language is a game, a set of operations, sort of between and amongst people that distribute bodies, distribute social relations, that trigger actions, that arrange things a certain way. You say a certain thing, you get something happens. Something happens. I am positioned towards you in a certain way. In the utterance of it, in the saying of it, in the use of it, I'm positioning myself as something necessarily, right? And that's something in rhetoric we call the ethos, right? What it's usually referred to as authority, but need not be authority. It could be undermining my authority, but it's my position, and then there's the utterance itself, and that includes the meaning and the reference. But you can never isolate the meaning and the reference from the social dynamics, from which are always historical, they're cultural, they're local, and they're inflected with things like affect, right? Because you can say something ironically, right? You can be like, he's guilty. It's very different than guilty. In a courtroom, it might not matter, but right, it's not just the utterance of the word guilty. Certain conditions have to be met for that, for guilty to mean that particular thing and arrange bodies a certain way. All right. So what I want to suggest is that language and words are not these units that we use to signify something, but that they are gestures. And I love this word gesture. I don't remember if it was my word or there was a critic, sort of mid-century critic called R.P. Blackmer. Probably no one's heard of, but I have, because I wrote about him in my dissertation, where he talks about meaning as gestures. That the first word isn't just an utterance of to signify something. It's a whole gesture. It's a whole inauguration of behavior. I think about baby crying, right? An infant, right? They're not outside of language. We say they don't know how to speak, which is true, but they're already part of a language game, right? And they cry, something happens. right? That's a gesture. Our will is to gesturality, and our gestures get more and more refined to make more and more refined positions and actions within a social milieu. Try not to use the word milieu and not feel sort of like a douchebag, which makes me want to use it all the more. I'll use it with my clients sometimes, and I always say to them, first in this exercises, we're going to establish the rhetorical milieu of your brand. And I can't help but laugh every time I do it. I bring that up because I'm not just stating a fact when I speak as such to clients. I'm situating myself. I'm building a relationship. I am, a social professional. We can't separate these things. There's a whole elaborate language game. The language games of work, the language games of the social, the way I'm being read certain ways, the way I want to be read, the way I want certain things to happen as they go on. And it's not always just what I want, but sometimes just what happens, right? In uttering and speaking, we inaugurate things above and beyond what we mean all the time, right? If that weren't the case, romantic relationships would be so much easier, right? But we say things, and whether we think we intended a certain action or not, we may have upset somebody, pissed somebody off. Our passive aggression might come out, or just plain old aggression might come out, or straight up passivity might come out. So language is, I want to again suggest that there's no such thing as language as a set system of words and tools. That language is not just this tool set, and then we have the use of it over here. What Derrida initially initiates, but still juxtaposed, right? But what he initiates is that there's a structure and an action, and he suggests that there's a tension between the two, in which the two are constantly sort of undoing and doing each other over and over. I want to begin from a different place altogether. I want to say, Derrida, I dig that, but what if structures are stranger? What if structures were never these stable things, and moments weren't just these instances of a structure? What if structures, what if it's all in the mix? What if structures are, they're always at work, but what if they're always moving? What if in the moment of using language, in the actual word I write or thing I say, I am not taking something out of the tool shed, right? These words and these grammars, but I am creating, in the very act of speaking or writing, I am recreating language itself. That the structure itself is constantly being worked and reworked, right? In such and such a way. It's not that certain modes are deviations. It's that certain modes are more radical recastings of a structure, but that every use of language, everything we say, everything we write, every moment is a recasting of the structure. The structure doesn't pre-exist us per se, right? It is constantly re-inaugurating itself in the very act of our use of it. Deleuze will call this repetition, right? That it's not language to our use of it is not some meta thing to an example of the thing. It's not categories and then an instance of that category. But that the category itself, in the very use of it, becomes a new category. We're constantly recasting. So that when my kid sees a woman dressed in black and white and goes moo, he has recast language, right? He has now said that moo was a thing that we used to signify cows, in fact now signifies black and white, right? He's shifted the terms, right, of category, the structure of language. Does that make sense? So what am I saying? What am I asking you? Does that make sense? What doesn't make sense? And of course we don't step in and say, no, son, that's not right. That's what a cow says. But she's not wrong. What he has done is he hasn't He hasn't failed language. He's just not speaking the common structure, right? And of course, because this kind of father I am, I would always explain that to him, right? I would say, that's not wrong, but just know that generally, you look at a woman and say, moo, it's not going to go well for you, right? And he doesn't know that, right? Telling him the rules of the game are such that if you do that, things might not, turn out so well for you. But it's not wrong, right? So in the genealogy of morals, this is what, this is not genealogy of morals, excuse me, in Truth and Lies in an extra moral sense, Nietzsche says, a word, there's no necessary correlation. A correlation between a word and a thing. Not only that, but a word for him is a gesture. Right? He doesn't use that word, but for him, it's always interpretive. It's always interpretive. So it's setting up a relationship. And when I use a word to, let's say, signify, to speak of something, that word is always dialing up and dialing down, amplifying and de-amplifying certain aspects of that thing. The example that I always give is the moon, and in French you say la lune, in Spanish la luna. Is it la luna, el luna? I don't know. Luna, right? They look up and they see light. They see light, right? In English it's much stranger. We say moon, right? We don't talk about light, and apparently moon has a unclear etymology, but one theory is that it actually comes from menses, from cycles, from the fact it's not just the light per se of the moon, it's its cyclical nature. When we say moon, we're not designating light, we're designating its return, right? Its disappearance and its return. Each word then is an interpretation. It is a gesture. It is assembling things. It is doing something. It is dialing up certain things, dialing down other things, right? It is an order word. It is a performative in as much. And again, those things, I don't mean to conflate them. They're slightly different. But the point being that words don't just signify. They do things. They create. They create. They create. And so for Nietzsche, a word, when we use a word for something, for him, that's a great poetic moment. It's a moment of reckoning, of interpretation, of saying yes and no to something, of cutting and assembling and deciding these are the salient aspects of this thing. This is what I like about this thing. But the next time I see it, I might want to call it something else, right? But language in the age of rationality and the rationality of the collective begins to sort of suppress that poetic instinct. This is what Nietzsche argues, that the poetry is at the basis of language and the basis of the human, that is our will. Our will is to be poetic, but that we have this other will, which is to suppress the poetic and then assume the sort of commonality, so that whenever we look up and see that thing in the sky, we always say moon, 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 moon. So it's no longer interpretive. It becomes habit. I no longer look at it and have a unique moment. I don't have a relationship to it, right? I just copy as opposed to repeat this word, moon, right? And in fact, we then say to call it moon is true, right? And that if I call it the light of my lover's eyes, I'm wrong. And in fact, I might be insane. As a side, that's where Foucault looks at the history of madness in civilization in his dissertation, because the things we call mad are often the things that don't fit within a local culture's definition of the true, of being in the true is his phrase. So my son, black and white, he now shifted categories around. So black and white is moo. And the teachers, of course, would always say, no, that's wrong, Felix, my son's name. That's not right. And what I was saying to him is, no, that's a poetic moment. You might want to know the rules of the game you need to play here, right? And that's in fact what I always tell him about school. It's like school is not really where you're going to learn great things about the world. It's performative in that you're going to learn how to play certain games, certain rules, You're going to learn how to negotiate state-mandated rules here, right? Under 18 is not allowed to not be in school, which still flabbergasts me. How the state thinks it knows how to parent better than I know how to parent my son, but that's for another time. But that school is, I mean, I figured this out pretty young. The majority of teachers I had were just absolutely insane. I mean, just demented lunatics. And yet they have this power. I have to do things they say. So we say one of the main functions of primary school is negotiating lunatics and assholes with power, and learning what to do with that. Learning when to shut up, when not to, and when you brush up against certain limit terms that might react badly to you. It's performative. The school setting is not one of a transmission of information and knowledge to the students, who then learns things and goes on. It might also be that, but is primarily a game, a set of rules. And the use of language is not to establish and accrue knowledge as it is to learn the rules of this game, to know how it operates and the kinds of words and the way they need to be assembled so as to operate however it is you might want to operate. Right? And so I want to suggest that when we speak, that language doesn't exist, that what we have instead of language, right, which is this thing linguists can study, and we can look at under a magnifying glass and dissect, but we're using language to do it, right? So it's using hammer to build a hammer, right? It creates a certain epistemological impossibility that I want to suggest instead of language. We have rhetoric. The rhetoric rhetoric begins the moment language exists, right? Because if language is always a set of terms and social dynamics and the distribution of bodies in a way, what ones I want to attract, ones I want to repel, ones I want to say over here, man, woman, right? It's a system of division and conjunction and posturing and how I stand towards the crowd, certain words I use. If I curse, I don't curse. I gesture, don't. And there's that word gesture. Gesticulate, don't gesticulate. That's what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is language in use, which is what language always is. And that the primary unit of language isn't the word, right? That's, if we study language, say, well, there's words, and then words go together, create grammar, and there's punctuation. I want to say that rather than this primary unit being a word, it is in fact a gesture. And the gesture is an interpretive moment, it's a relational moment. It is a relational moment between me and the thing, right? When I look at the moon in the sky, I'm seeing cycles as opposed to the light. But also I'm uttering it in a certain context, and it's a whole set of relations between me and the world and myself in the past, and a relationship to other uses of that word. Right? So a gesture is simultaneously structure and event happening at the same time. It is the event of recasting the structure. Right? That's what gesture. That's what communication is. So yeah, I want to leave you with this, right? That there's no such thing as language. Not really. It's a subset of this thing called rhetoric, and that words, it can be helpful and useful to talk about these things called words. It can be useful to talk about language and grammar, especially when we're learning a second language, although more and more, I believe second language learning is more about immersion, unlike when we were kids and you had to memorize your inflections, and I don't know how language is taught anymore. William Burroughs argued that language is a rhythmic thing, right? That if you repeat its rhythms, you'll be fluent. You just play the tapes. That it's not about learning the meanings of words. It's about inhabiting a certain posture. And we know this, right? I mean, to me, it was always sort of funny, when we were young in a French class, and people, trying to repeat something, Je suis, je suis, you see that, right? So you speak with a French accent, but then your phatic discourse, your ums and ahs, go to English, which always sounds weird, right? Because a language is postural, it's gestural. It's always already gestural. That's what it is. It is gestures that we then inhabit and inflect. So instead, French goes, je suis un homme, right? And you can hear that right, that phatic, P-H-A-T-I-C, phatic discourse. Those are the things we do, like I just did, where I'm keeping communication open, but I'm not signifying anything, right? A lot of language is phatic. Is a great example of phatic discourse, right? Meaning, learning language is not just a set of words, but as you learn the language, you begin its gestures. You start, it inhabits the language, right? It is a whole constitution of the self, right? It's a whole mode of going. So yeah, that's what I want to leave you with. There's no such thing as language, and not really. And words, words are these things that can or cannot be useful, but that we exist in rhetorical milieu, always, already, primarily, and necessarily, and that the things we use to communicate are not words per se, but gestures.